Hello everyone, Santir here, and welcome to the next part of my Religion for Games series. Today we're going to be talking about changing your religion, the way it changes over time. So this is going to include basically the two meta categories of evolving your religion and fracturing your religion. So before I start, there's an important observation that's going to be recurrent throughout all of these, which is that the way that this sort of thing is handled is going to be really heavily dependent upon whether or not your religion has an actual deity with a will, or multiple deities if it's a polytheistic system. But if your religion does not have deities, it's all human driven. It's all based upon what humans think, how they want things to go, what sort of changes they want to make, and a lot of politics are going to get involved in the sort of way that things change. But there's other stuff too that we will touch on as we go. If your religion does have deities, remember that what happens, they're going to have some sort of hand or influence in. So you're going to need to make sure you think about what do your deities want, how are they going to be adjusting things, manipulating things, depending upon how overt or subtle they are and all that sort of stuff. So you're definitely going to have different ways that these things are going to play out based upon whether or not there's a real deity in charge of the religion, as it were, at the center of the religion, and what they want and how they're going to influence religions around them. It could be that you have a real deity that doesn't do a whole lot, but you might also have real deities that do a whole lot. So that's really important to keep in mind. Okay, so the first thing that I want to talk about here in my randomly ordered list of when I came up with these topics in my notes is divisions. And this is not just random, this is something that happens a lot. Religions, as they change, will have some sort of division happen with them most typically. So there's a couple of categories here. The first one is what I'm going to call factions. So this is basically branches of a religion that are far enough apart from each other that they are functionally different religions. So we have some examples of this in the real world where there are different flavors of religions, and often they don't get along too well. A classic example from Christianity is Protestantism versus Catholicism. There's often divisions there. There's also the Church of Christ, Mormons. I'm sorry, I don't remember the full thing. I know that they prefer that right now, but that's a variant on Christianity. I'm not going to get into more of it there, but you can see that there are different divisions, different factions, different ideas of how the religion should function that have developed over time, and that's something that will happen to most religions. Again, it depends upon if you have a real deity in charge that's not wanting that to happen. What do they do? How do they prevent that sort of thing from occurring, especially conflict between the two branches? But what's really important here about a faction is that when somebody is in one faction, they are quite confident that the other person is in another faction is in a different religion, that the two religions are not the same. They might share a lot of stuff. It might have the same deity or deity set as a focus, but they are, as far as the members of the religions are concerned, they are functionally different religions. So this is something that happens quite a lot. It's something to consider. Politics will often get involved in this, and this we'll talk about other ways that religions change over time, obviously, after we get through this section, and those topics that we'll be talking about, which will be things like theology, structure, and cultural impacts, those are also potentially ways for religions to fracture and wedge and split off, where some things can occur that way. There can also be geographical influences in this, where people living in one place will develop differently than people living in a different place. Something really important to keep in mind is just divergent evolution, as it were, where one group, because of their environment, if they're not communicating with other groups, right? If there's a geographical isolation happening, that will influence the growth and development of the religions, in that they will grow and develop individually, and they will have individual things. Again, what influence your deities have on this could be really important and could really modify this. The next one is what I'm calling sects, sects. So these are subgroups. These are internal divisions within a religion. So the key difference between this and a faction is that members of a different sect believe themselves to be part of the same religion as other members of members of different sects. So you might have one group that is internally, I don't know, like, I'm just going to pick a thing here. It could be a little bit wrong, but Like the Jesuits, I believe, are a variant on Roman Catholicism, but they still consider themselves Catholic. I might be very unclear on that. I'm not an expert on that, and if I'm wrong, please correct me in the comments. But my point here is that there are different internal groups that they all think of themselves as belonging to the same religion as other internal groups, but they have different focuses or slight different variants on how they do things, stuff like that. So this is something that you're really likely to see in polytheistic religions, because you're going to have different people that emphasize the worship of one particular deity over another. For example, maybe you worship one deity so much that, say, you name your town after her, like, I don't know, Athens. But anyway, that's something that you're going to see, especially the more religious an individual is. I mean, like the priests, clerics, whatever, monks, nuns, whatever sort of especially religiously focused individuals you have. In polytheistic religions, there's a pretty good chance that it's going to push further towards we are focused on this particular deity. And they might pay some amount of homage and reverence to the other deities within a polytheistic religion, but they're going to focus on their main deity of choice. So this is a couple of ways that divisions will occur. So an example of this is you might have, and sects can become factions given enough time as well, should be added. But an example of this is you might have a couple of deities where everything's very mushy at the beginning, but as things grow and develop, and we'll talk about this, but things will become more structured and more organized, and you'll start to get some of these individual sects that form, whereas before it's just like a priest to all the gods or things like that, and it becomes more organized as time goes on. So these are divisions. This is a key part of how religions will change over time. So think about how things might fracture, particularly as we're going into the next sections, because the next section, I'm pointing down because it's lower in my list of notes, but the next sections are going to discuss ways in that religion itself will change, and those can spawn sects within a religion and factions that separate branches of the religion. So those are important things to consider, and as always, how do your deities get involved in any of this is always really important as well. So the next topic here is theology. So theology is largely a term that means like the study of God. It comes from the Greek theos, which is God, and then like the study of or whatever. Anyway, logos probably, so like God words or something. I'm not an expert on that, but it's basically what do people believe about the deities? What do people understand? What do people know? This is something that over time likely gets refined. And when I say refined, it doesn't always mean it's improved. It's really important to remember this. It's similar to how with like a decimal number, you can get more precision means you have more digits. So 1.5 has a certain level of precision. 1.5392746 is a much higher level of precision, but that does not always mean more accurate. Keep in mind that more precision or more refined theology may not be more accurate or better. It just means it has been more codified, more explicit, more laid out, and those sorts of things. So part of what will happen here is you have thinkers and people thinking about this. Again, this is a spot where it's really important to remember what influence does your deity have in this process? How open are they? Because again, it's the study of them, right? So the more open they are with individuals, the more that this can happen, and just all sorts of stuff. This is a key spot actually in this whole process of refinement, where things like miracles can really come into play, where if you have some sort of like power source that's being worshipped or something like that, or like an internal magical system, this can be an area where that stuff gets really codified and really organized and structured, and the way that this sort of stuff happens gets made more precise and more defined. Or perhaps there's more specific systems. Perhaps you have a very limited deity in the regards of the number of people they can interact with at a time, and so the process of getting access to them as more worshippers, followers, naturally develop as populations expand. They're going to have to perhaps have some way of organizing how people come to interact with them, get power from them, that sort of stuff. So you can imagine that there are processes there. Perhaps you have to have your character go through stuff like that, or you can have mechanical things that are connected to that sort of concept. So overall, theology will tend to get more refined. It will get expanded. Another really important aspect of this is how dogma, which is beliefs, and doctrine, which is teachings, will change over time. There's one really important way that these tend to change, which is that they tend to get well, let me back up. Human nature wants, like, we as human beings want to be able to think of ourselves as good. We want to be able to be good in our own eyes. This leads to self-righteousness, but it's also how we often become comfortable with ourselves. We don't want to think of ourselves as bad people. We want to think of ourselves as good people. The way that we normally do the math, as it were, on whether or not we're good people or bad people is to kind of add up our actions as we kind of arbitrarily pick and choose what actions we're paying attention to, the stuff that sticks out in our mind. What are the bad things we've done? What are the good things we've done? How do we think the good weighs against the bad? It's a classic thing that we see, like the weighing of the heart in Egyptian mythology and other things. So we see this this concept. Now, keep in mind, you can have real deities that don't do this. It's argued that the God of the Bible does not weigh. He says, if there's any negative in your record anywhere, that's all negative. Like you can't add enough positive to outweigh that. I'm not going to get into more of that there, but the point is, this is how we as humans usually do it, is we say our good deeds and our bad deeds add up to a number line, and if it's 0 above, we can think of ourselves as a good person, and if it's less than that, we have to be a bad person, and we have to do something to try to atone. So we have to do good deeds to try to atone for our bad deeds. That's kind of usually how we think of atonement. So the way that we then do this is we tend to want to define what are good deeds, what are bad deeds, how good are they, how bad are they, and we create hierarchies and scales and all this sort of stuff on what are good deeds and what are bad deeds, and how much does one weigh in the other, and all that sort of stuff. So this is the way that we tend to go about organizing morality, I guess, for lack of a different phrase, and that process then tends to influence things like doctrinal and dogma, the teachings and the beliefs of a religion, especially if there's not a deity actively involved in trying to correct that. Now, how obviously involved they are in trying to correct that is another matter entirely, but in standard practice, we as humans will define morality stuff so that way we can try to think of ourselves as good people, and that will then play out in the doctrine. So an example of how this works from the Bible, actually, is you have the not working on the Sabbath thing. It's one of the 10 Commandments. Don't do any work on the Sabbath. Keep it holy, or whatever. And that is a very vague thing. What is work? Now, the Old Testament law defines it as, like, you're not supposed to, like, do your ordinary sort of household chores and things like that. So you have to prepare meals ahead of time and all that sort of stuff. And people are not supposed to do their daily work. We fast forward to Jesus' day. There have been a bunch of prophets that have come in between that have, like, you guys are desecrating the Sabbath, you're not keeping it, you're doing awful things here. So they are very strict about not working on the Sabbath, to the point where they've, like, figured out how many steps can you walk before you're doing work and all that sort of stuff. So it's very rigid, it's very structured, and it's very strict. Jesus comes along and says, you guys have got it completely wrong. This goes back to the refinement thing. So they refined what it meant to work on the Sabbath into a much more discrete set of rules that they could follow to think of themselves as not disobeying the law of not working on the Sabbath. And that wasn't, Jesus didn't like that. Basically was like, you guys took this overboard. This would be the idea, regardless of what you believe about it, the idea of a deity coming in and correcting an overstep. But this idea of the way people advance things over time and trying to make their doctrine clearer and more black and white without as much gray, so that way they can more easily codify, are they being a good person, and all that sort of stuff. That's sort of the process that we're looking at here. And stuff that you can do here that I think is really interesting is the idea that people might have taken, especially with, like, a power source type deal, they have taken something that has a lot of potential power and codified it so much to the point where it's greatly diminished the actual power that people have access to. And then you can have a hero or some other character that discovers, wait, I can just raw tap into this and do like amazing things that we didn't think were possible anymore. And you can do something like that, which could be a really interesting basis for a story. Or what would be really cool, I think, would be if you present the really heavily codified version to the player in some sort of mechanical sense. Maybe something like, I think Magicka does things where you like put different elements into a bar and then it makes spells. And you can give the player specific formulas, but then if they start to experiment, they can be like, wait, I can do really powerful stuff if I don't just follow the formulas. And then you can have them like branded as a religious heretic and things like that and do all sorts of crazy stuff that way. So that's a way that you could have some mechanical expression from some of this idea. So I think that's pretty interesting. The next topic in this evolving and changing a religion whole thing is that more structure will likely develop overall. So this is going to be things like hierarchies in general. Basically, think about how the different models of your religion will affect things as you're going through. But typically, you will see religious roles become more refined and more defined, or maybe not. It depends upon the base structure of your religion and how much it invites that sort of thing. But in typical, as the member base expands, organization has to adjust to compensate for it. So it might have a strong hierarchical structure going like all the way to the top, especially if it's a state religion or anything like that. Theocracies, all that sort of stuff. That's going to become typically very a strong, rigid structure that has, a central character at the top. Call it your god king, call it your pope. Probably don't use actual pope as the word, but that concept. And then you have levels below that, and then levels below that, all the way down to individual temples or shrines or whatever you have for the locations of individual worshippers and stuff like that. So a lot of that stuff will tend to develop structure. You could also just have it where the religion is a lot more loosey-goosey in how it's practiced, in terms of like each individual village kind of does things its own way. There's different ways that you can approach it, but keep in mind that like structures and stuff like that will change over time. And one of the big ones is going to be how people interact in terms of a lay clergy split. So the lay person versus clergy and how people become clergy. So priests and clerics and all that sort of stuff. So how do they become a member of that? And is it hereditary? Is it require other things? Like, what do deities have to do with it? How do politics get involved in it? Politics is really important for changing religion because human beings will always have politics develop. So what are the politics internal to your religion? And how does that change how the religion plays out is always really important to think about. So think about how that structure may change, may grow rigid, and may become abused by human ambition. And then also think about how any deities you have will interact with that. Will they work to stop it? Do they have enough power to stop it? Or will a human machine run away with things and the deity kind of is pushed out of their own religion? That's something that you could do as well. There's a game there in a deity that's trying to reclaim their religion. I've always thought it would be an interesting game to make kind of a traditional god game where the people kind of go off on their own rails and kind of do their own thing and maybe are not so great at following you, and then you have to figure out how you want to handle them. How wrathful are you going to be to your disobedient followers? Important stuff to kind of think about as things change is what if there's an actual deity, what is their response? Do they hand them over to their enemies? Do they send invading armies at them? Do they cause natural disasters? Are there plagues? All sorts of stuff. Do they send prophets to try to warn the people? There's all sorts of ways that sort of stuff can play out. It can impact your story as well. Obviously, it can become a key part of your story. Or it could be so much background noise. Things like that. And then finally, and this one's really important as well, are cultural impacts. because there's going to be different things that, like, culture changes over time, right? So when your religion is localized in an area, the changes to that culture are going to change stuff with the religion. And the religion is going to change stuff with the culture. Like, there's an interplay and interrelationship there. But one of the big things is, if the religion starts to spread, what are the influences from outside cultures going to be? Are there going to be outside deities that get involved and wrapped up in the religion? We'll talk a lot more about influences from other religions in the next episode, because that's specifically going to be religions in conflict and handling multiple religions and things like that. But in terms of just cultures, those are going to change things. What are their customs? What are their rituals? How do they go about life? How do things interact? How do moral codes interact? For example, Christianity is known for spreading ideas about covering up the human body, particularly Protestantism and stuff like that. But as colonialization happened, there were pushes towards bodily modesty that got pushed as well, in areas that perhaps did not traditionally practice it the same way. That's culture spreading through religion, but religion also changes culture. Things like the Yule log and Christmas trees and all that sort of stuff. Even Christmas itself is a different skin on a different religious celebration. So there's ways that these things interact, like holidays and all that sort of stuff, cultural traditions. So it's important to think about how culture is going to change religion and how religion is going to change culture as your religion changes over time, and especially if it spreads to other areas, and how do other people interact with it. But I think that kind of covers most of what I wanted to talk about. Again, the big things to remember here are, one, there are going to be things that are going to influence the religion, things like structure that just naturally are going to develop over time. Humans love to create bureaucracy, things like that. The impact of culture, both changes within the internal culture as well as the influences of external cultures, the influences of trade and all that sort of stuff. And then theology over time is going to likely get refined, but not necessarily improved. It's going to become more structured. Dogma and doctrine, that's beliefs and teachings, will also tend to change over time. How does any deities you have interact with this? And then finally, these things will likely lead to the development of individual sects within your religion, as well as factions of your religion branching off. And those factions may not get along so well. So we will talk next time about how religions in conflict happen, how all that stuff goes about, and handling the interaction of multiple religions. So until then, everyone, take care. Goodbye.